Wet, so
It curls.
I wouldn't know. Anyway, now with that being said, let's get the ball rolling. And the first item on the agenda is the Macon Middle School project. Mitch,
Yes, sir.
you're right up. Come on.
Excellent. Well, I love starting out. Well, appreciate y'all having me back today. And you know, I guess this has been a couple years now that we've been coming and thinking about capital and CIP. And this year we're going to do at least start out the process with something similar to what we did last year, with the exception of we're going to add in and look at the specific funding of Macon Middle and look at the impacts Macon Middle School has on the plan that we've been working on. And then after funding Macon Middle, where does that leave us for other CIP related projects? And I know we've got a presentation here.
You're down there minimized on the bottom of the
Oh,
PDF.
got it. All right. And y'all have a hard copy in front of you. Some of these numbers may be easier to see or not legible either way, but I'm gonna work off the hard copy as well. There's page numbers in the bottom right corner, and just quickly on page 2, just give you a sense of what I want to get through today. I thought it would be helpful to go back just quickly. It's been a year since we've talked about it. What is a credit? What is a credit rating? How would we stack up? And what are some of the peers that we would have if we needed to get a credit rating? You know, when we're talking about funding a project like Macon Middle School, a public sale of bonds, which would require a credit rating, is going to be one of the options that you all will have the opportunity to consider. So we'll kind of go back through that and set our minds around what is a credit rating and where would we stack up. And then we'll look at our existing debt. You know, we're a year further on. We've got some updated information related to assessed value. What does our existing debt look like? And where are we on the debt ratios that we've looked at for the past couple of years? How do we stack up? And particularly as we start layering in some of this new debt, how will those debt ratios evolve? We're going to talk about the Macon Middle project, look at funding specifically for that, and then we'll revisit our capacity to fund additional capital projects after Macon Middle is funded. Okay? So high level, on page 4, you all do not have a credit rating right now with any of the national credit rating agencies. You don't need one. You don't have any public market bonds outstanding. You have been rated in the past, as recently as 2015. And when you were rated in 2015, you were a AA2 by Moody's and a AA- by Standard & Poor's. And you can see in the chart on the right where you would stack up back in 2015. With Moody's, you were 2 notches or 2 steps away from the highest possible rating you could be of AAA. With S&P, you were 3 steps away from the highest possible rating of AAA. And I would expect that you all would generally be in this same category. You would be in the AA rating category. It's just a question of whether it's a AA1, AA+, AA2, AA, or AA3, AA-. But in my mind, you will be in that AA rating category should we go out and pursue a bond rating as part of this financing or any future financings. And what does that do for you? Well, you know, much like your credit score when you go to get a mortgage, your credit rating is going to be one of the key drivers of what the interest rate is on your financing. It's something that investors will look at when making their decision to buy your bonds and at what interest rate that they're willing to purchase your bonds. Similarly, banks are going to go through a very similar process as the credit rating agencies do. They're going to do it internally, and they're going to assign their own internal credit score to the county, and that is going to be a driver of the interest rate that a bank is willing to offer you. So credit is an important concept, whether we're going to the public bond markets or whether we're going to do a direct bank loan like you all have done in the past. And so as part of this analysis, that's one of the reasons why we keep in mind some of the things that the rating agencies look at to understand how the decisions that we're making as part of the process could impact our credit, ultimately could impact our interest rate, and impact the overall plan. And I should have said this up front. Please feel free to stop me along the way and make it conversational. I'd be glad to have back and forth. So I thought it would also be helpful to just give you a sense of high level what the rating agencies and or banks are looking at as part of their process. And I find Moody's is easier to talk through because they have less categories, but they have 4 basic categories that they're going to look at when doing your rating. Economy and tax base, finances, management, and debt and pensions. And the 2 highest categories are economy and tax base and finances. Those 2 items are going to make up over 60% of your, or 60+% of your rating. What's interesting here is that economy and tax base, this is things like your assessed value per capita, your median family income as compared to other median family incomes around the United States. Those aren't items that you all as a board can address in this budget. You can start to take steps to do economic development and bring in jobs that are paying more in the future, but there's no one thing you can do as part of this budget to impact that economy and tax base score. So that's why you see that's more of long-term control. So therefore, that leaves 70% of your, that's 30% of your rating that you can't immediately control. So that leaves 70% of your rating that you can have an impact on, and that's what we tend to focus on. And you all have done a nice job of setting yourself up to have a good credit rating and to access the capital markets with the way you've managed yourselves financially, with the management decisions that you've made and the practices that you do. And as we'll see, you do have a very reasonable debt burden at this time. You have capacity to take on debt without causing any major issues with that debt score. All right, so I'll stop there. Please jump in with any questions. All right, so revisiting your existing tax-supported debt, on page 7, the county has a little over $25 million of principal outstanding. That's all in installment purchase contracts or limited obligation bonds. Those are credits or securities that are secured by an asset. So like a home mortgage, you have assets that are serving as security for all of those loans. $25.2 million outstanding, and it's all going to be paid off by 2034. So you're repaying your debt fairly quickly. And the other thing the other nice thing as we're thinking about future debt is if you look in the graphic, this graphs your annual debt service payments, and you can see your annual debt service payments are declining over time. So every year, starting in 2021, your annual debt service payments are stepping down. So that in and of itself is going to allow you to consider adding in new debt service or some element of new debt service and maintaining your same existing debt service budget level. And we're going to look into that in a lot more detail, but I think the graphic does a nice job of showing without doing anything, without assuming any revenue growth, as long as you can continue to budget your same debt service level, you do have some future debt affordability based upon the existing budget level. Okay, but talk about some key debt ratios quickly. The first one that we've talked about in the past that we'll talk about today is the 10-year payout ratio. And this is a measure of what percentage of your principal repayments are you making in the first 10 years. Basically, how quickly are you paying back your debt? And you all are repaying 94% of your debt over the first 10 years. That's a very good payout ratio. I mean, you're almost retiring all of your debt over the first 10 years. There's a little more information on this ratio on page 8. You can see very quickly in the next 5 years, you're going to be at 100% payout ratio. So barring the issuance of any additional debt, within 5 years, you would be paying off all your debt within a 10-year period of time. That's an excellent payout ratio. Folks who have policies tend to be in the 50 to 55, maybe 60% range on this 10-year payout ratio. So you're well above any potential policy that you might consider. And that's something that I know we've talked with staff a little bit about, that you may want to think about as we go forward, is a series of debt policy guidelines or financial policy guidelines specific to debt. As you're continuing to evolve through the CIP process, as we're starting to issue some larger bond issues or larger financings, it's just something that provides another layer of structure to the CIP process, and setting maximums for the amount of debt that you would have outstanding, or some other ratios that we'll talk about. It provides some structure, it provides an element of transparency, maybe an element of comfort that we are looking at issuing some debt, but we're doing it responsibly within a series of guidelines that we have adopted. And this is, the 10-year payout ratio is one policy that we would recommend if you wanted to consider those. Okay. Another key ratio that we often recommend policies on is debt to assessed value on page 9. And this is your debt as a percentage, debt outstanding, principal outstanding, as a percentage of your tax base. So you all, again, the roughly 25 million on an $8 billion tax base is about 0.3%. So you're about 0.3% debt to assessed value. That's an excellent level. Policy-wise, we typically see something in the 2.5% to 3% range. So you're well below any potential policy. And on this graphic, let's look on the right-hand side. This is one of the peer comparatives that we're looking at. And what we've got here is we've got Macon County in the gold bar up top. This is you all are at 0.3%. The light green bars are national rated counties. So all national rated counties that are in the AAA category is the first bar. The AA category is the second bar. That's the category where I think you would fall in. And then national single A is in the bottom bar. Similarly, the dark green bars go in the same order. North Carolina AAA counties, North Carolina AA counties, and North Carolina single A counties. And what you see is on this ratio, you're below all of these medians, right? So both national and North Carolina. Now, the national medians are less apples to apples than the North Carolina medians. You see all the North Carolina medians are higher than the national medians. Well, nationally, there's counties in other states that aren't required to fund schools. Places like South Carolina have school districts that have their own taxing power, their own tax rate, and they issue debt to fund schools. So that's why the national medians tend to be lower than the North Carolina medians. So that even being the case, you're still below the national medians here where you stand today at 0.3%.
And Mitch, what, the ones under Macon County you got listed as 2020, what's the latest data that these others were compiled?
So these folks are, it's a combination of 2018 and 2019 audited data. Some people in other states are on a different fiscal year, not everybody's a June 30 fiscal year. And then we're populating this data from Moody's MFRA database. So this is straight from the rating agencies, the exact data that the Moody's analysts are pulling, and they update this database as the financial reports are provided to them.
And it does include 19.
Yes, sir. For everybody who's reported 19 to Moody's and they've been able to put in their database, it includes 19. So it's as up to date as it can be at this point with the data we have. The other thing I'd point out on this page is the rating agency criteria. So down below, on the bullet below the peer comparatives, Moody's has a criteria for general obligation credits that says debt to assessed value that falls below 0.75% is going to get their highest possible rating, which is a very strong. And then anything 0.75 to 1.75 would be in their next highest strong category. So that just gives you a little more perspective with where you are today at 0.3%. You're at the very top of their top category of debt to assessed value. Okay. Last one, debt service to expenditures. This is a measure of your annual debt service as a percentage of your annual budget. And it is, to me, it's a measure of both debt and flexibility within your budget, right? So debt service is a fixed expense. We know what your debt service is going to be through 2034. We can tell you that to the penny, what you're going to have to pay every year through 2034, and you're going to have to pay it. It's not something that you can control unless we refinance it for savings. It's not something that you can control. You can't furlough debt service. You can't, close early on a debt service payment. It is what it is. You've got to pay it. And so, as a measure of budget flexibility, you don't have any flexibility with that payment. You got to make it regardless of where revenues come in or where other expenses come in. So that's one of the reasons why the rating agencies and we tend to focus on this ratio, because it provides two indications, both budget flexibility and debt load. And so you all, your debt service versus governmental expenditures in FY20, it's about a little over 6.5%, 6.6%. When we look at policies for this ratio, they're typically in the 15 to 18% range for this ratio. So again, you look at where you are at 6%, you would be well below a potential policy. And then when you look at the medians, you're well below the North Carolina AAA and the North Carolina AA median. And you're still in line with or below those national medians, which we know tend to have a little less debt than North Carolina counties. So you're in really good shape there. And S&P, they have a very specific criteria for net debt as a percentage of total governmental funds expenditures. Same thing we're doing here, same calculation we're doing. Anything less than 8% is in their very best category, and then anything 8 to 15% is in their next category. So again, 6%, you guys are doing great. And I think overall, what you see from all of these ratios, I think the takeaway that I would impart to you is you've done a great job of managing your debt budget over the years. You have debt capacity. It is reasonable for you to consider utilizing debt as a tool to fund some capital projects, given where you are on these ratios, given how you stack up to peers, and given where we typically see financial policy ranges. So I think you're in good shape there on these ratio side. The other side of the question is affordability, right? What do our cash flows look like and how much is it going to cost us? Two different questions that get to the same result. And that's what we start to revisit that cash flow affordability discussion on page 11. And I apologize, I know there's no way y'all can read this on the screen and probably not in the book. But I want
Third column down, third one over.
What page? I can read the page number.
I'll walk you through it at a high level because I wanted to give you a sense of, staff has worked with us to really put together this model, and I know we've talked about it before on an 11 by 17 page. The first section that's sectioned off by lines, I think y'all can probably see the lines, but it's columns B through H, is your debt service and capital requirements. And the first column, B, is your existing debt service. That's the $25 million of debt outstanding plus interest is a little over $29 million. It pays off in 2034. The next column, C, is a placeholder where we're going to layer in our new proposed debt. Columns D, E, and F are the ongoing pay-as-you-go capital program. These are the pay-as-you-go capital levels that were established over the last couple years as part of the CIP process. And it's going forward, it's assumed at $700,000 for general CIP pay-go, $1.15 million for school pay-go, and $600,000 for annual vehicle pay-go, so your annual vehicle replacement program. All of those numbers going forward, starting in 2021, are fixed dollar amounts, and we've got them planned in every year in all of our cases. Columns I through T, which is the big middle category here, these are the revenues that you all have identified as being available to pay for debt service and capital. And the first two columns, I and J, are transfers into the debt service fund. One is from the general fund and one is from Fund 21, which I think is school related. Then we get into column K, which is your lottery funds, and those are budgeted in our model at $300,000, which I think is a little conservative compared to what you've gotten before. And we've left those funds flat. We haven't assumed any growth in those lottery funds. Given some of the uncertainty that tends to surround those lottery funds, we don't want to count on any growth, and we've been a little conservative in our estimate there. The towns participated in a loan with you all, and they pay a share of debt service on one of your loans. That's column L. Column M is our sales tax available to be spent on one-time capital. This is something that we've worked with staff on and talked through. Rightfully so, you need to be conservative on your sales tax. It is a revenue source that is very volatile. So you're conservative in your budgeting process, and you tend to outperform on the sales tax. So the idea is you continue to budget conservatively, and there's a little bit of sales tax that falls to the bottom line at the end of the year. Those dollars from the prior year can then be used for pay-as-you-go capital in the upcoming year. That's a function of the way you budget, the way sales tax works, and if anything were to happen and you had a bad year, you could hold off on the pay-as-you-go capital spending. So I think that's a very good approach to using sales tax dollars. Then columns N, O, and P are the budgeted amounts for the CIP pay-go. You've got those amounts built into your budget. And the idea is you continue to budget those same amounts every year. The revenue will offset the expense. And then columns Q and R are some subsidy payments we get from the federal government associated with some debt issues we have outstanding. So we total all of that up in column T. And what we see is in column U, I know y'all, hard to say, but in column U is our annual surplus and deficit. And right now, with just your existing debt and funding the current pay-go levels, you have surpluses every year going forward. And those are the dollars that you can use to fund the CIP, both additional pay-as-you-go capital and debt service. And those amounts start out, I'll read you a couple of years just to give you a sense. In 2021, it's a little over $700,000. In 2022, it steps up to $960,000. In 2023, it's over $1 million. In 2024, it jumps up to $1.5 million. So over the next 4 years, as we saw, your debt service payments are going down. We've got our revenues that are staying constant, and that's going to create some dollars in the future which are going to be freed up to pay for debt service and or capital. Right now, we are tracking those surpluses over in column Z, and we're calling that the capital reserve balance. You have a little bit of capital reserve balance starting out, and we're adding to that every year with the surpluses. Now, we're going to start to use those surpluses, and that capital reserve isn't going to build up like it's shown on this page. But this is just existing debt and existing CIP obligations. Okay? Now we'll get into what y'all really want to talk about. But I think it's important to cover that on the front end so you've got a good understanding when we look at these models and laying in the new data. So the Macon Middle School project. We understand that y'all are considering moving forward with the renovations at Macon Middle. Current estimated project cost at $15.3 million. Based upon the current timeline for that project, we're estimating we would be in a position to issue the debt in October of 2020. With the local government commission, there are some findings that they have to make to approve your debt before you can issue it. And to make their findings, there are certain things that they need to have related to the project, namely project bids and permits for the project. One of the findings the local government commission has to make is that the debt you're issuing is adequate but not excessive. And so they come to the conclusion that if you have project bids that are backed by good permits, you've got a very reasonable expectation of what the project cost is going to be, and we can make sure we're borrowing enough or setting enough cash aside to fund that project. So based upon our understanding of the current schedule, we're thinking we could be in a position to get that local government commission approval around October of 2020. That timing will all depend upon the project schedule, but right now that's the assumption, October of 2020, which means you would likely have an interest payment probably of around 6 months in the upcoming budget year. Fiscal year 2021, you would make your first 6-month interest payment. So we're going to layer this project in. We're going to assume it's financed over 15 years. Probably, certainly if we go the public bond route and even if we went the bank route, we could probably get a 20-year amortization. The 15-year term is going to be a little more conservative. It's going to have a slightly higher payment on the front end, so we went the conservative route. To the extent we can stretch it out another 5 years to 20 years, that would lower your annual payment, so it would make your payments lower on the front end, less of an impact on your budget, but it is going to cost a little more interest over time. So as we evolve through this process, we'll continue to look at those scenarios and give you some better numbers on that to make a decision as you get closer to actually doing the financing. But right now we've got 15 years flowing through the model, and we're assuming a level principal amortization, which is what the LGC likes to see for governmental projects. And again, in all these cases, we're funding your annual CIP pay-go amounts. Okay? 14 just shows you how your debt service evolves graphically as we layer on this Macon Middle School project. So you are peaking out based upon these assumptions at around $5 million in debt service, and it's coming down from there. We revisit your key ratios on page 15, and the message here is, like we talked about before, you're in great shape. Even adding the $15 million of new debt, you stay at very strong levels on all of these ratios. You have capacity to issue debt under these ratios.
Mind if I step in for just a second?
Yeah, please.
Mr. Manager, I know we're talking about $15 million in debt here, and I presume that's for the complete project.
Yes, that is.
I thought we had 10 or 11 million coming from the state.
And that was Chester and I discussed this the other day. We proceeded forward with this project knowing that, there's some urgent repairs, safety-related concerns at the middle school that need to be addressed. So we proceeded with this project as if we were going to bid it out, do just like we're doing. And in doing that, I always had in the back of my mind that on this day in the middle of February or the beginning of February when we would be talking about this, that we would have an answer on that state money. But it is my understanding that there is $11 million that will be coming to Macon County from the state to go towards the funding of capital projects related to education. And that is all the details I have about it. And again, I thought whenever we got all this packaged, I think and Dr. Baldwin as well, we thought we would have a clear answer and, hey, we've got this $11 million over here and here's what we're going to do with it. But as of right now, that day hasn't came.
And it's not on the horizon.
That's what it's looking like.
That's right.
Well, crud.
Okay.
I don't think you're alone in that. I think a lot of people are waiting for the budget to get passed. Yes, sir.
May I ask, as we structure the financing, is it possible
that we build something into the documents that basically says if we have to finance it for the full 15 million, that if we receive this 11 million, we can pay it down without penalty.
That's certainly a possibility, and it depends on which route we go as to how flexible we can be and how that would impact the interest rate. If we go the public sale route, that's a little less common in a public sale, but it's certainly doable, and we would just have to evaluate how that would impact the interest rate. If we go the bank route, there's certainly some banks that would let you pay it off, at any time at par. Others will not.
I assume you're talking about the difference between like a general obligation bond and GS 16820 financing.
Yeah, apologize. I should have been more clear on that. So we're anticipating this would be a GS 16820 financing, typically called an installment purchase financing. That can be done one of two ways. Like you've done some projects in the past, go directly to banks, put out a request for proposal, ask for banks to respond to those proposals, and then evaluate the bids, choose the best bank, and you close on basically a loan with the bank. The other way to do that is to issue limited obligation bonds in the public markets. So it still would not be a GO bond, but it would be a bond that would be sold in the public markets, and instead of going to a bank for a loan, you go out with a security and you sell those securities to public investors.
Now, the bond method that you're talking about, is that going to have to be approved by the voters?
No, sir. It's done under GS 16820. It is an installment financing.
Okay.
It is just sold to investors as opposed to a bank.
Now, and this is where I really need your help. I'm going to show my ignorance here. I'm thinking that there's some regulations that basically indicate that as far as tax exempt financing is concerned, we're limited to issuing 10 million in 1 year.
So that is to issue bank qualified tax exempt financing. The bank qualified designation, you're limited to $10 million. But you can do tax exempt debt over $10 million, no problem.
That's where the bond.
It just doesn't have that BQ or bank qualified designation. And some investors and some banks can give you a better rate if it's bank qualified. It benefits them. Others, the way they've structured themselves, it doesn't matter at all. There's one bank who gives me a higher BQ rate than a non-BQ rate.
That 10 million ceiling, is it not cumulative of all financing that the county does in a year?
Yes, sir, that's right. So this one financing, if it ends up being 15 million, would take away your ability to do bank qualified financing.
Unless you use some of your fund balance.
We can still do financing, it's just non-BQ.
Yeah, it will be tax exempt. It will not be taxable. It will be tax exempt. Very good interest rate. Right now, we're seeing tax exempt, non-bank qualified interest rates in like the 2% or less range.
One concern I have though is if you go with the bonds, I think you observe that you don't see that waiver of prepayment as a typical. I think that's going to be important to this board. If you have $11 million show up from the state of North Carolina's bond issue, I think you're going to want to at least have the ability to consider paying down that debt immediately.
And I think,
and if you don't build that into the structure of your financing, you're likely going to get hit with a penalty for paying early.
I think that's right. I think the other thing to probably be chased down is when the money actually comes through is what sort of restrictions or limitations are on those dollars. If we've already funded a project, are we able to pay off debt with it, or does it have to pay for hard capital costs?
No question. Is there a place where we can get the information on what can and can't be done with those bond funds from the state that I've seen?
I'd probably DPI would be the...
No, I asked Dr. Ball on that. DPI's not got anything in on it either.
I mean,
Yeah,
it seems to me that's essential for all 100 counties planning.
The positive is the penalty's not that great. If you go through DPI, they don't know what, they can't tell you that, but they said, well, the interest is not, the penalty's not that great. I don't know what that means.
Well, I mean, in bank financing, you might see as much as 1%.
Yeah, well, I've seen 1% prepayment penalty.
I mean, it's kind of all over the board. I mean, there's some banks who will tell you, who will require what they call a make whole call, which essentially says, if we loan you the money at 3%, and
Yeah.
you pay it off and we're in a 6% interest rate environment, you've got to make us whole
In other
for the
words,
difference between those.
They get the benefit of their bargain over the entire life of the loan. That could be a nightmare.
That's right.
I wouldn't worry about the lead to me.
What I hear you saying though is that we need to find out if there's a way to find out if this is for new capital, like a new build or renovation monies. Can the 11,
It's my understanding that it can be used for renovations as well as a new build and as well
But
as
you-
new
so it's either
construction.
or, you can do it.
But you do have to know whether or not you can reimburse yourself.
Sure,
Right.
yeah.
From the-
We gotta find out whether we can reimburse
Yeah.
I'm
ourselves.
with you. Now,
And that I don't know.
Now, Mitch, let's talk about the schedule there for a second. So everything starts 4 months into 2021. That's October.
Yes, sir. So the idea would be, the assumption that we've made is you would, for debt schedule purposes, for modeling purposes, you issue the debt in October, and traditionally you make semi-annual interest payments. So you would make a payment 6 months later in April 1 of 21. So you would have 6 months of interest in fiscal year 21.
Would that be the first payment?
Yeah,
That would,
In April of 2021?
2021, yeah.
and that would be
Next
interest.
2 months, we won't be doubling up. That's what I'm trying to figure. We're not doubling up no more.
No, you issue it in October of 2020, and then 6 months later, you make your first interest.
And it wouldn't matter if we backed that up in, would it help us if we backed that up to July?
If you back it up to July,
We
then in
could have two.
January. If you backed it up to July issuance, then you make your first interest payment January.
Yeah, I mean, we can play with the structure,
Yeah.
you know, I mean, if we issue in October and you said, you know, I want 3 months of interest, well, if we issued in October, then we could pay interest in January, and then in July, and so you only have 3 months of interest in fiscal 21. If we, you know, honestly, depending on when we closed on the debt in October or even into November, there's a chance that we could push the interest payment to not starting until fiscal year 2022. But for modeling purposes, conservatism on the front end, we wanted to make sure we had 6 months of interest in
For the
fiscal
county
year
budget,
21.
that's real important, is the time factor is,
Yeah.
a
Well,
couple of months can make a big difference.
Yeah,
So-
well, the October date is based off of what the architect has preliminarily told us, that construction would start October. So of course, you want to line your debt issuance up when you're
That's
about ready
right.
to start. So that's where all these are based upon. And like Mitch said, just trying to be conservative at this point with modeling, so.
Yeah, if that project slips out some, there may be a chance that the debt service could start in the following year. But if it gets accelerated, the project goes more quickly, which all projects go more quickly, right? You may have a little more interest in 21.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir.
Mitch, the relative cost of bank financing versus the bond financing, closing cost and actual interest rate cost points, or is it going to be about the same, or?
This isn't a dodging your question. It depends on the
Just
market.
gonna have to look.
Those things change from time to time. What I'll tell you is, we bid out a 20-year limited obligation bond installment financing for another city recently, and we did a comparison to the public market sale, factoring in the difference in cost of issuance. Public sale is going to have more cost of issuance. You've got to pay rating agencies. You've got to develop more documentation, so it tends to cost a little more than a bank loan. The all-in difference in the cost equated to about 15 to 20 basis points right now, 0.15 to 0.2% on the interest rate. Recently, I've seen that difference as high as 50 to 70 base, 0.5% to 0.7%. So it really depends
Just gonna have to
upon.
look at it at the time.
Yeah.
And you never know if you go out with a bank RFP, does a local bank say, I really want to support that project, and they get really aggressive on the interest rate? You just never know.
Okay, thank you.
And one of the things I know Lori and I have talked about is, not to get too specific into the financing, but I know one of the things that we've talked about, and one approach that we often take is, we call it a dual track approach, where we will, on the front end of the process, we'll put out a bank RFP and see what rates we get back. Maybe we can snag a really good rate from a bank. We can compare that to the public markets. Public markets are very transparent. We can tell you within pretty good certainty of what type of interest rate you would have in the public markets on any given day. And then you've got a bank bid in hand, and we can tell you pretty closely what the public markets look like. You can make a decision at that point in time.
Let me ask you a question.
Yes, sir.
You have the superintendent in here.
Yes, sir.
There's people on his board is asking, because at one time we had this at a starting time, let's say in April, and we moved it now to October. They're asking him why. Is it due to this, trying to get this financing model in place, or to close the budget, or what's?
No, we don't.
What's his
You have to
answer?
ask the architect that.
Okay.
That's, the
He said
October
that.
was based on the architect, so I don't
He was asked
know
that.
where
the
all
other
that
day.
falls in.
Dr. Ball was.
It's nothing to do with the financing at this point.
Okay.
I mean, yeah, it takes time to finance, but
We will have, as long as we know when permits are going to be in hand and bids are going to be in hand, we can work together to have the financing put in place in time. The one caveat to that is, once you get to November, we have to get LGC approval. Once you get to November, the LGC will require the CAFR, the current year's audit, to be in place for approvals after November. So in our case, in October of 2020, we can get LGC approval based upon the FY19 CAFR. Starting in November of 2020, we're going to need the fiscal year 2020 CAFR. So we are in kind of where we're projecting, it's kind of a tough time frame. If it slides by a month or two, we'll kind of be at the mercy of the audit for when we can get our LGC approval. I know Lori does a great job, but there's things out of her control that don't necessarily line up well.
if we started today with the financing, how many months would we look to be LGC ready, so to speak?
Yeah, I mean, I think we really want to.
It's about 90 to 120 days. at
Yeah,
least.
it's about a 90 to 120 day process. We can make it work. We could take 150 days if we wanted to and take our time. We could get it done in 80 to 90 days. Again, it's really all going to be driven by the project. When are bids going to be in hand? When are permits going to be in hand? And that's going to drive us. I would probably say on the front end, we wouldn't, if we do a dual track approach, we would probably want to get bank bids back, sometime around 60 to 75 days before we would want to close on the financing. So if that gives you a sense. So you back that up, that's 90 days would be kind of the quickest process. Y'all haven't even let me get to the good news yet. The good news is, on page 16, based upon these revenues and the cash flows that we've identified, and I did, in this case, I collapsed all the revenues down into column I, so hopefully these numbers everybody can read. You can cash flow the debt service associated with a $15.3 million 15-year loan and fund your annual ongoing CIP projects. You can do that under the existing revenues you've identified. So there is no revenue shortfall associated with financing this project. That's the good news. The one downside is, you look over in column U, that surplus deficit, well, now it gets down to zero, and we're actually using a little bit of that capital reserve for a 3-year period of time. So you can cash flow under, conservative 15-year level principal payments. You can cash flow this proposed project without having to come up with any additional resources. But it will have an impact on your capacity and ability to fund other capital projects down the line. And that's what we're going to show you here coming up, is looking at your capital funding capacity. 18 just kind of sets it up for you. We've done this, we've calculated this again with the middle school and all future financings at 15-year final maturity. 20 years would improve these results some, but 15-year final maturity. And we're going to maximize your capacity by issuing additional debt as quickly as we can based upon your cash flows. And we'll do that under 4 cases. Case 1 is going to have just your existing revenues. So we're not dedicating any new revenues to fund debt service or capital, just what you've got today. Case 2 is going to be adding the equivalent of 1 penny on the property tax rate. So that can be a new penny, a rededicated penny, savings on expenditures, finding it elsewhere in the budget, but the equivalent revenue of 1 penny. And then the equivalent revenue of 2 pennies in case 3, or the equivalent revenue of 3 pennies in case 4. Just to give you all some perspective. And so we've got that summarized for you on 19. And I think in the interest of getting you to the high level, page 14 is your total debt issuance capacity under each of these 4 cases. Case 1, with no additional revenues, you can issue 18.3 million, 15.3 of which is for the Macon Middle School project. Then if you had the equivalent of 1 penny in revenue, that jumps up to 27 million, to 35.8, to 45.3 million with the equivalent of 3 pennies of revenue. And all along the way, we're still continuing to fund the pay-as-you-go capital. So in all these cases, you do have your pay-as-you-go capital funding. So the bottom line, the last green highlight on the page, shows you what your capital funding capacity is under these 4 scenarios. And it ranges from 30.5 million to 57.6 million. One more page for perspective, and then y'all can tell me what I did wrong. Page 20 summarizes your CIP department requests. These have not been management adjusted, obviously not been prioritized by you all as a board. This is just as the requests came in, we've summarized them for you. And over the first 5 years, there's requests, column G, line 14, total requests of $133.5 million. So when we look back with no new revenues, we've got 30.5 million of capacity versus the 133 million of potential requests. There's obviously some prioritization that's got to take place and some discussion about what projects are priorities, what do we need to do, and does it fit within that 30 million of capacity, or do we need to look at finding some additional revenues? I'll pause there.
That's all she wrote in.
I'm happy to go through all the details. All the details of the cases are in the back, but
Just a general question.
yes, sir.
I should ask this earlier, but if reference page 11, when we look at the columns, and I've looked at this for 2 years and hadn't asked this question, so I apologize for that. These pay-as-you-go items that we've got placeholders in, why are those flat? Why haven't we accounted for inflation or the one I just was at Franklin Ford, and they helped me understand that vehicles cost more this year than they did last year. And at a $600,000 level, Shouldn't we be taking that into consideration in those numbers?
Yeah, great question, and your manager actually asked the same question. We talked about this the other day. We can certainly add that in. The idea here, the concept here is you've got an offsetting revenue for that 600,000. And so, theory being that your costs of a vehicle are gonna go up, but if the costs of a vehicle are going up, people are buying new vehicles, and so you're getting more property taxes in from those higher costs of vehicles. Property values are going up, you're getting more taxes in from that. Sales, things are costing more, so your sales tax is going up. So you, in theory, have inflation built into your revenue side as well. So by having a one-for-one offsetting revenue, the assumption is your revenues are going to realize inflation at the same rate as the costs. And if you would prefer us to look at that a different way, we're happy to do that. That's just,
Makes sense.
Mitch, go back over there to the total requests,
yes, sir.
maybe on 20 again.
Page 20.
And for your reference, there's another really small table for you. Back behind page 47, there's a little more detail of like what makes up those. This is on a departmental level, but behind tab C, page 48, kind of gives you the projects that are associated with this. I don't know, I think Lori's got this electronically if you'd like to blow it up and look at them.
Yeah, I'll be glad, I'll email it to y'all, yeah, you can. And just one note on this 133 million number on page 20, that doesn't even include the proposed Justice Center
Yes,
that Mosley
thank you.
recommended.
It does not.
It does not.
Just 70 mil.
So, yeah, these numbers are staggering to me when you compare the capacity we have on page 19 to the needs we have on page 20, so.
And just to add to that, to remember though, if we do, when we incorporate, and of course, we've just recently been presented the space needs analysis, and we'll work this year going through that and getting those recommendations, however, so we're going to incorporate it into this plan. But if you do that 70 million Justice Center, you're going to gain some efficiencies in here that you can pull some of this 133 million off of here because it'll no longer be needed. For instance,
And that's a good point, Derek, and I think that, if that's the route that we go, then that needs to be incorporated in it to offset those so we can really have a true picture of you know, that $133 million number, you know, maybe, I don't know, 150, 160, maybe 120, but, you know, we talked about that before, there's offsets that we can realize.
right,
You know, to make a decision, we need to have those incorporated into it.
absolutely.
You mentioned a couple of times other revenue sources. What are those commonly?
Well, so you're saying instead of property tax?
Just other revenue sources, period, including property tax. That's the standard, isn't it?
Yeah, yes, sir. So,
Sales tax.
yeah, I mean, so typically your general fund budget, the two biggest categories are property tax and sales tax. Those are your biggest revenue drivers.
So when you mention other revenue sources or increasing other revenue sources, those are the two main items that we look to increase revenue, if it's increased revenue if it's needed for these.
The thing you have direct control over is the property tax, right? But I often tend to talk about, when we talk generically, we're not talking about anything specific here. When I talk generically, I talk about a new penny or a repurposed penny. So maybe those dollars are being used for something else in the budget right now, and you prioritize this over that, then you take that penny from that and you put it towards this project. So that's why I think maybe I didn't explain myself very well, but that's what I was referring to, is you either come up with a new one or you find it somewhere else in your budget.
In relation to what Paul's talking about there. Now, in this sales tax increase with the quarter cents or whatever it may be, isn't there a time frame in there that you have to take it to the public and they vote on it?
So if you're, the Article 46 quarter cent sales tax requires a referendum.
When is too late to ask that? Are we in that?
It's gonna be.
You're not too late to get it in this fall.
Yeah, for November
Would
of this
be, I
year.
think, too late for the primary.
It's too late for the primary. Do you have
And I'm not sure you really want to do it at the primary anyway. I mean, we can look at it and
You have
see.
to do it at the primary.
I think it could have been done at the primary. We would have to look at the statute to see whether we've got time.
Right. Well, we was in that in Jackson County, that, was there a time frame there that you really have to stick close to?
You do, because the ballot has to be printed and show that on the ballot. And there are some timelines on that.
On this funding source that Mr. Higgins is talking about, if we're looking at that as a funding source, we're gonna have to capture that thought real quick, aren't we?
Well, and you can't count that chicken before it hatches either,
Right,
because it may or
don't
may not pass.
Right. But if you're gonna try to go that way, isn't that something we're gonna have to have a,
Yeah, I would think it would be well advised for this board to start thinking about that real soon if they're inclined to ask if that go on the ballot.
We certainly wouldn't want it on the primary. The state did that on the Connect One bonds and a primary, a low turnout bond, or the low turnout.
Time to do it.
I think what you end up having is people that are really for it or really against it are all the ones that show up to vote. So
Early voting is 13.
I'm not sure that's a good thing.
What percent of our current debt, and you may not have broke this down, I'm sure Laura has, what percent of our current debt, 24, 25 million, is educational debt?
I have to break it down, I just don't have it on me.
Yeah, I wouldn't expect.
A great majority of it is, I don't know if you have it anywhere.
Yeah, I was just looking, we often,
Sometimes you'll put the debt back there, but.
yeah, I've got the debt details, I just don't have it summarized.
School, sewer,
it doesn't show up on page 48 when it shows how much.
pretty much everything's school except for the sewer debt and the library. The outstanding on the library, those library/community college is 510.
Mhm.
Outstanding on the sewer is 1.4. So only about 2 million of that looks like it's non-school.
That's right. May have been some of the 2013s that might have had some non-school, but
Those are all school.
they were,
Yeah.
the 08, the original 08s were? Okay.
So at the end, we'll wind up with about 38 or 40 million in school-related debt
Yes, sir.
once this is done.
Mr. Manager, is there anything that's holding us up from our perspective that we need to be doing for you?
I have a question for you before, I mean, I don't want to take your floor time.
For me? Oh, okay, yeah, sorry. Please take my floor time.
Because you made us, and I'm not picking on you, you made a couple statements, we had some safety and urgent issues we needed to address at Macon Middle School.
Yeah, I think, and Dr. Ball can speak to that as well. I think
This may not be the time to do it, but I wanted to get that on record.
Yeah, just the issues that were identified in the assessment by both Novus Architecture and SGA Narmar Wright as they walked through the school. Some issues that they felt like were pretty needed to be addressed, or it's just going to keep deteriorating. For instance, like water coming in the windows into the classrooms.
Should be a list of those things actually in that contract that you presented
The
from the
cabinetry and
architect.
flooring, yes, and they're in the contract that we'll be discussing later on too when we get to it.
Any further questions for Mitch? Thank you, sir.
Thank y'all for having me.
Appreciate it.
Thank you, appreciate it.
Good to see y'all.